Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be traveling back to the wonderful world of Eternia with He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, number 6. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in March of 2013, we can see right here there is a phenomenal cover by Dave Wilkins. However, this is actually a wraparound cover, so why don't I just open this whole thing up so we can drink all of it in. Much better. And upon opening up the cover, we get to see that Skeletor is wielding not only the Havoc Staff, but what appears to be a purple sword of power, identical to the one that He-Man is wielding. This is actually paying a little bit of tribute to the original Mattel toy line, for those of you who don't know. The figures were packaged with one half of the Sword of Power. He-Man and Prince Adam came with one side of it. Now, He-Man's was gray. I want to say Adam's was like a pink or burgundy-ish color. I can't remember off the top of my head. If you remember, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. That would be great. And Skeletor came with the other half, which was purple. The idea being that they both had one half of the sword, and you could combine them into a single sword for one of these characters to use while you were playing with them. Now, this concept was kind of dropped for the most part in the original Filmation series, though in the revamped series that happened in the early 2000s, I want to say around 2002 on Cartoon Network, they did give Skeletor a double sword that could be taken apart into two individual swords that he used in the show, and he was also packaged with this in his blister pack. But it was not the Sword of Power. It was a completely unique sword that, was not wielded by He-Man and had nothing to do with any of the powers of Grayskull. But I do like the fact that Dave Wilkins was paying homage to this with this cover. They're fighting in front of Castle Grayskull. We can see the Sorceress and King Randor in the sky above. And on the back cover, we can see both, well, more than both, the images of Evelyn, Beastman, Triclops, Trapjaw, and what I believe might be Cobra Khan off the side of the page. It doesn't matter really though, because Cobra Khan is not in this issue, and for that matter, neither are Trapjaw or Triclops. I don't know why they're depicted on this cover, but they're not anywhere inside this book, and I mean, I want to be angry about it, but I can't because this cover is too good. I really like this, and I really wish that Dave Wilkins was the guy who was doing all of the interior artwork too. Unfortunately, he's not, and we're dealing with Popmon instead. Now, this being a DC published comic book, it does in fact mean that the inside cover will of course have an advertisement on it. This advertisement is for King of the Nerds, a competition game series that was on TBS. I vaguely remember this show existing, though I can confidently say I never once watched an episode. What I do find interesting about this, though, is we see here down on the bottom, it's being advertised as a new competition series that begins on January 17th of 2013. And as you may recall, this book came out in March, meaning that this series had already been airing for several months by the time this book was published. And I have to wonder if the people who paid for this advertisement at TBS were just a little bit upset about the fact that this was supposed to be a preview ad for a show that was going to be coming out, not for a show that they had already been airing for, I don't know, probably 8 to 12 weeks at this point. So I wonder if at any point they had their legal department contact DC or Warner Brothers and, just kind of be like, hey guys, what the hell? What were we paying you for? Once we get into the story, we see that they are in fact still on the tropical island of Evelyn, as she is doing her best to gather up some things to make her escape, screaming at her servants, telling them what to grab, scolding them for grabbing the wrong things, to the point where they get confused, and she tells them that she doesn't want to hear them saying yes ma'am unless they're doing what she asks. One of them responds by saying no, of course not. Unfortunately, Lynn takes this exactly the wrong way and starts to yell at him, screaming how dare he say no and try to defy her. And she eventually just gets fed up and torches him with an energy blast of magic from her hand, as we see his body ignite in flames, leaving a skeleton on the floor smoldering. Lynn then tells the other man to keep at his work and scolds the man that she just torched for smelling up the air in her quarters and stating that she should have him flayed as a result. Not that it would matter at this point, or be possible given that he no longer has skin. She then states that they have to hurry as she can't see that her warriors are going to be holding off He-Man for very long, and that she doesn't want to be here when he arrives. However, when she opens the door, she's greeted by exactly what she doesn't want to see. Of course, Lynn's worst fears are confirmed as we see that He-Man, Man-at-Arms, and Teela have made short work of all of her warriors and burned their village to the ground, and now they want answers. He-Man makes a not-so-veiled threat to Lynn, but Lynn tries to balk at it, stating, "You've never once hit a woman in your life, and you're not going to start now." However, Teela chimes in and states, "Yeah, well, I have no problem slugging you." And Lynn realizes that she's about to be on the receiving end of some serious payback. Meanwhile, back at Castle Grayskull, Skeletor is still coming to terms with the fact that his plan has blown up in his face, and is in the middle of a heated argument with the mysterious skull mask that we still don't know a whole lot about, as the mask is rightfully pointing out many of the gaping holes in Skeletor's plot, kind of stating, didn't you realize that this was a possibility the whole time? And Skeletor tries to rebuke him, saying, "Look, I always knew this was a possibility had I let He-Man live, and it's my underling's fault for not killing him when I asked." However, the skull states, "Yeah, but if this was so important, why would you leave that task to your servants? Why wouldn't you have just taken care of it yourself? You always knew where he was the whole time." And Skeletor once again tries to brush this off, stating, "What's the point of having servants if they don't serve?" And the skull mask then gets to the root of his servant quote, stating, "Or to, take the blame when it ultimately fails so that you don't have to accept blame yourself." At this point, Skeletor kind of loses it and just states, "This conversation is over." The mask states, "Yeah, for now." And Skeletor states, "No, forever," as he just chucks the mask straight out through a window, losing his cool after he realizes that his whole plan has failed and he really has no one to blame for it but himself. Also, we finally get to the credits of this book, so let's go through them right now. Writing by Keith Griffin. Art by Popmon. Colors by Lee Loffridge. Letters by Ciata Temofonte, I believe is how you say that. Cover by Dave Wilkins. Editing by Michael McAllister. At this point, Beastman tries to pipe up, stating, "Master, does this mean that he's coming?" And Skeletor completely flips out, as is usual, stating, "Of course he's coming, they're all coming." And Beastman seems confused. "What do you mean, all of them?" And Skeletor tells him, "All of the Masters of the Universe. I had the spell linked to He-Man. As long as the spell was active in him, it was active in all of them because this amused me." As he tosses Beastman to the ground, Beastman says, "Well, then should we get everything ready for the battle ahead?" And Skeletor states, "Is that your concern? Really? You're just worried about getting all of the battlements ready and placing troops? By all means, go right ahead. It's not going to make a difference." We then see Beastman take the two soldiers that were with him as he goes off to prepare for the upcoming battle. And we see Skeletor standing alone, stating, "Nephew, if you really think that this is going to work, by all means, come right ahead. You're going to learn why I am the Master of Doom. Come to me, nephew. Face off against your Uncle Skeletor." We're then teleported to the small village of Veridus, where we see that many of the many's a strong word. Some of the Masters of the Universe have gathered together in a small inn that was a choice of Teela's. And this village is actually very remote. So remote, in fact, that Ram Man is kind of giving Teela a hard time about it. But Teela states, "Would you rather we have done it right outside of Castle Grayskull so that Skeletor knew exactly where we were all gathering?" Ram Man admits that she makes a good point and that meeting in this secret location is probably for the best. And he's really just kind of venting on the fact that he's been under Skeletor's spell for months now and is only just realizing who he is and what he should have been doing the entire time. We see that He-Man is trying to get everybody on the same page, as he's not really so certain that all of them should be rushing Castle Grayskull together as a cohesive unit, and he believes instead he should be doing it alone. We then get a 2-page ad for Incredible Crew, along with a small little 1-page mini comic that is supposed to be an advertisement for the show. I only vaguely remember the existence of this show and have absolutely no idea what it was about. And if you do, feel free to let me know in the comment section below, because this show is a complete mystery to me. Stratos then interjects, stating, "The Masters have always stood with you in the past and will stand with you today." However, He-Man states that's exactly what he doesn't want. At this point, Randor interjects, asking He-Man, wouldn't this just be playing directly into Skeletor's plan? However, He-Man states that no, it wouldn't, because Skeletor only thinks about problems the way that he would approach them, because his ego is so overblown. He states that if Skeletor were in his shoes, he'd be approaching with the biggest army he could muster, so if He-Man goes it alone, it will be the last thing that Skeletor expects. Teela understands his reasoning, stating, oh, the way that a thief believes everyone is stealing from them. And He-Man says, yes, of course. But at this point, Teela states that she still thinks this is far too dangerous and is concerned about what will happen if Skeletor manages to, and in her words, put the whammy on him once again. However, He-Man responds by stating that won't happen because Orko's not here to betray us this time. This, of course, is the first time Orko's even been mentioned in this series, and we're now learning that he is the entire reason why Skeletor's plot was able to succeed, because he betrayed all of the Masters, including He-Man, and cut a deal with Skeletor, which allowed him to not only put all of the Masters under a spell, but also take over Castle Grayskull. At this point, Randor decides that he's going to stand his ground as king and tells He-Man that he's not going to allow him to make this decision all on his own, and allows all of the Masters to vote on whether or not they're going to attack as a team or let He-Man handle it on his own. They, of course, all vote that they're going to go at it together and face Skeletor as a team. And we see that He-Man's not too happy about the decision as he sits alone petting the tiger Cringer. Or maybe he's just referred to as Battle Cat in this series. I don't recall exactly, but he never seems to be portrayed in the goofy, cowardly way that he was in the Filmation series. Teela states, oh, so you're just sulking here alone? And He-Man responds by stating, I don't sulk. She then states, well, you sure as heck did slink off over here when the vote didn't go your way, and what did you expect? You didn't really believe we just let you attack Skeletor and his entire army by yourself. And He-Man states, I didn't slink away, I'm just, deep in thought, and I'm probably just going to leave as soon as it gets dark and no one's paying attention. At this point, Teela flies off the handle, stating, why on earth would you even tell me that? You know now that you've told me that, I'm going to have to go with you. He-Man says, no you don't, you could just stay here, but Teela reminds him if she stays here, she's either going to have to lie to all of the other Masters, including the King of Eternia himself, or she's going to have to face all of their wrath when they are all rightfully questioning her about why they let He-Man just walk off alone and didn't alert anyone else. He-Man realizes that she's making a good point, but Teela then also brings up the fact that regardless of whether or not he had told her, she probably would have noticed he wasn't around and decided to follow him anyway. At this point, He-Man states, well, maybe you could just remember that from the start next time instead of yelling at me, but Teela states that wouldn't be any fun. Now, up until this point, we've only seen 2 advertisements throughout this entire issue, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's not so bad. Well, in the immortal words of Space Harrier, get ready, because there's about to be a lot more. Starting with this ad for the Arrow television show, which aired on the CW. Many of you may have watched this show and may remember it, as it was a monstrous success for Warner Brothers, along with the multitude of spin-offs that spawned from it. Getting back into the story, we see that Castle Grayskull is now surrounded by Skeletor's army as they prepare to face off in what they believe is going to be a massive battle. Skeletor, Evil Lyn, and Beastman stand along the battlements of the castle. As Skeletor states, I can feel his rage approaching. Beastman is shocked by this, as is Lyn, as she states, I should be able to feel that as well, and something must have gone wrong with my powers when that wench struck me. This, of course, is referring to the black eye that we see her depicted with here, as she, of course, was struck by Teela. But Skeletor is not interested in hearing any of this, as he simply tells her to quiet her mouth. And he then states that he plans on facing off against He-Man alone, and he defeated him once before and will do so again. However, Beastman is quite shocked by this and states, "But Lord, the power of Grayskull, if there's anyone who can access it, it surely must be He-Man." But at this point, Skeletor instantly rebukes him, stating that Grayskull itself is nothing more than stone and mortar and history, and that the only power is the power that He-Man channels through the sword. And at this point, Beastman is kind of shocked by all of this, and he states, "But you said you felt the power." And Skeletor reminds him that what he felt was what the sorceress made him feel through her spell, and now that she's no longer living, his eyes are opened. This, of course, is the first that we're learning of the sorceress's death, and we also see that Skeletor has been on a more ruthless streak at this point, as he seems to have given up entirely on capturing the power of Grayskull for himself, and now seems focused more on just eliminating He-Man and ruling Eternia with no one to challenge him. But Evil Lyn actually chastises him at this point and states, "If you knew the sword was the conduit, then why did you hide it with me? You should have kept it nearby so that when you figured that out, you could have used it to access the power." However, Skeletor takes this opportunity to use his magic to seal Lyn's mouth shut and begin to chastise her, stating that the Sword of Power is linked intrinsically with He-Man, and that it will only respond to him and no one else, and for anyone else, it is simply just a sword and nothing more. We then get an ad for Justice League of America #1, which is, of course, another DC comic. And I am kind of surprised by the number of advertisements for other comic books that happen in here, as this isn't something that was being paid for by anyone because DC wasn't going to be writing checks to themselves. Getting back to the story, we see that Lyn is trying to talk, but unfortunately, as I stated, her lips are sealed shut and she can't utter a single word. Skeletor continues to ramble on, stating that the sorceress's spell was woven deep into his mind, and that he only saw what she wanted him to see because it was in fact what he wanted to see, and that he's actually rather impressed by the entire illusion, and even states, "Well played," as he looks out in the distance thinking about how everything is played out. There's suddenly then a huge explosion, and Beastman starts to yell, "My lord, he approaches." And Skeletor's like, "Yeah, of course he approaches. Do I need to pull your tongue out of your head too?" He then realizes that at this moment, the battle is at hand, as he states, "Well, it seems as though that it's going to come down to me and him, and that it ends here and it ends today," as we see that Skeletor is preparing to make this the final battle between he and his nephew. We're then treated to a full-page splash of both He-Man and Teela riding into battle, Teela having procured a unicorn somewhere, and the two of them seem to be more than a match for the entirety of Skeletor's forces. However, despite the fact that they're holding their own, Teela does seem to be wavering a little bit in her confidence, as she states to He-Man that she maybe should have listened to him and not followed him. However, He-Man states, it's a little late to be thinking of that, and Teela actually is a little bit upset about this and states, "Do you have to be so smug?" He-Man responds by stating, "I thought I was being charming," but Teela tells him it's hard to be charming when you're covered in someone else's blood. He-Man states, "You're one to talk, look at yourself," but she responds by stating, "Yeah, but on me it's a fashion statement." And this is actually rather important, as we see that the two of them are depicted as using basically full-on lethal force, and this is something that is not common to see in Masters of the Universe titles, and I can't think of a time before this that they were ever depicted as just full-on slaughtering their enemies like this and just hacking them to pieces. Not that I'm upset about it. It is kind of cool to see that, this is a more mature version of the Masters of the Universe story, and we're seeing something a little bit different than what we've seen before. We then see an advertisement for Vibe #1, and I had completely forgotten that DC at this time was trying to push Vibe more towards the forefront of the DC universe, making him a member of the Justice League of America, and also giving him his own solo series. Keep in mind, this is several years before the Flash television series would appear on the CW, and Vibe would be introduced on that series to a wider audience. So it kind of shows that they were really making a long-term plan of Vi being a much bigger character than he had been prior. Getting back to the story, we see Skeletor suddenly teleport onto the battlefield and land behind both He-Man and Teela, who are rather shocked. And Skeletor states, "You didn't really think I was just going to hide up on the castle walls and wait for you to show up, did you?" And at this point, Teela states that she's just going to hang back a little bit and watch He-Man's back, which he thinks is actually probably the best idea. And He-Man states, "No, I knew that this was about you and your grab for power. It's always been about power, the deceptions and the subtle torment." And at this point, Skeletor becomes rather perturbed and even annoyed, and he states, "You call this torment subtle?" We then get an advertisement for Katana #1. Katana being another one of the lesser known DC characters that they were really trying to push more during the New 52 era. I don't know how well it worked out and how much she's really used in DC Comics today, but at this time they were really trying to get her out and in the forefront a little bit more than they had in the past. We then see that Skeletor pulls out the Sorceress's head and holds it in front of He-Man, as he states the Sorceress would disagree with the idea that my torments were subtle. This, of course, enrages He-Man as he lunges forward and tries to strike Skeletor with his sword, which he blocks with the Havoc Staff, and is actually rather happy about the fact that his plan has worked and his nephew is now trying to actually kill him. He states, "That was a lethal blow, and you finally see me as the threat I truly am." At this point, his soldiers try to join into the battle, but Skeletor states, "No, don't approach me." He then jams the Havoc Staff into the ground and states that He-Man is mine and mine alone. The ground then opens up in a circle around the two of them, and a wall of flame shoots up from the chasm. Teela and Battlecat narrowly escape the blaze, and Teela realizes that she was almost killed by this battle between He-Man and Skeletor. Skeletor then strikes at He-Man again, stating, "This is it, I'm going to finally take care of you myself," and He-Man is rather surprised as he states, "Really? You're not going to hide behind your lackeys like normal?" Skeletor, however, is not detoured in any way as he unleashes a blast of magic which grazes He-Man's shoulder, and he states, "I had you, you were mine, I should have killed you, the power of Grayskull be damned." And He-Man just rebuttals by stating, "You think you're going to defeat me, but while you may have won the war, the battle for peace will always be won by people like me." Skeletor, however, is tired of hearing He-Man's ramblings and states that he's an altruistic fool and that he plans on finishing him off on this day. We then see an advertisement for Green Arrow #17, which featured a new creative team and an explosive new direction. I cannot confirm if this direction was explosive because I never read any of these books. I wasn't subscribed to Green Arrow. However, if you were and can confirm the explosive new direction, please feel free to do so in the comments below. Getting back to the action, Skeletor once again unleashes a blast of magic. However, this one connects and knocks He-Man back off of his feet and also knocks the Sword of Power out of his grasp and into the fiery chasm that surrounds them. We see that He-Man is now down and smoldering from the attack as Skeletor lifts up the Havoc Staff to deliver what he believes will be the final blow. He then states that the cursed sword was what always allowed He-Man to funnel the power of Grayskull to his grasp, and now that he no longer has it, what of the power of Grayskull is there? He then swings his Havoc Staff. However, at this point, He-Man turns around and grabs it mid-swing and holds it to the side, stating, "I still have the power, Uncle. You always believed, because of your huge ego, that the sword was the conduit by which the power of Grayskull was funneled to me." We then see an advertisement for Teen Titans #17, which will be featuring a brand new artist on this book. Again, I was not subscribed to Teen Titans at this time, so if you happen to know anything about it, and if it was any good, and if you enjoyed the new artist, please feel free to talk about it in the comments below. Back to the story, we see that He-Man confirms that the power was not funneled from the sword to him, it was in fact the other way around. The power was funneled from him to the sword, because He-Man doesn't just have the power, he is the power. as he rips the staff from Skeletor's hand and punches him so hard in the face that it actually knocks his jaw clean from his head. It also knocks him into the fiery pit that surrounded them, and upon seeing this, Teela shouts out, "Is he dead? Did the flames kill him?" And as He-Man begins to respond, he's immediately interrupted by an unexpected explosion. We then get an advertisement for the Batman City of Owls trade paper. I was subscribed to Batman at this time, and while I found the Court of Owls and City of Owls stories to be relatively intriguing and the character of Talon to be pretty unique, after that, when they rehashed the Death in the Family storyline and then went into like a Clayface storyline, I kind of just lost interest, which is unfortunate because Greg Capullo was drawing the book at this time, and as many of you know who follow the channel, he's one of my favorite comic book artists. Unfortunately, his art alone was not enough to keep me interested in buying this book every month, and I unsubscribed probably like 3 issues into that Clayface storyline. Back to the He-Man storyline that we're talking about in this video, we see a wall of flame erupt from the chasm as He-Man is actually jarred by how violent this explosion is. He then stands holding the Havoc staff and looks over to Teela stating, "Well, I guess that's your answer, he must be dead." However, he then says under his breath, "Liar," as he realizes that Skeletor is very much still alive and it was going to take more than that to finally end him. As he throws the Havoc staff into the chasm, he states, "Uncle, I certainly hope you learn from this because I have no pity left to give you." We then get an advertisement for the Hell on Earth storyline. Get it? H''EL because it involves Superman. Pretty good. This storyline also involved Superboy as well as Supergirl. I was not subscribed to any of these comics at this time, so if you know anything about this storyline, feel free to talk about it in the comments below. We then see that the Havoc staff falls to the ground at the bottom of the chasm and breaks in half, right next to the Sword of Power, as we also see that it lands not only near Skeletor, but more importantly the skull mask that he had thrown out the window. And the mask once again begins to talk down to him, stating, "Do you finally see now the error of your ways? That you have let pride blind you to reality?" Skeletor tries to say something back, however, the mask cuts him off and states, "You do understand that the power of Grayskull can never be yours because it chooses its own host, and that host will never be you." However, Skeletor once again refuses to accept reality as he simply states lies, but the mask is not ready to listen to him banter on about this again and states, "No, you're going to have to learn to accept the truth. Even in this state, you try to deny reality, but no longer will this be acceptable." Skeletor asks, "What do you know of any of this?" And the mask states, "I know many things. I know exactly who you are and who you are in your mind. And I also know of the gaping hole that exists within you where your soul once thrived. And you're going to learn right now that I am much more than the minion you always believed I was, and you're no longer going to be treating me the way that you once were." We then see that Skeletor is teleported to a completely different location that we have not seen up until this point. He's surrounded by all these evil-looking imps with glowing red eyes as he cowers before a throne that is sat upon by an unknown figure. The figure states, "I've played the part of the minion well over the years, don't you think? But now it's more important that I make sure you survive and live to fight another day. Despite the fact that He-Man would never find it in himself to kill you, there are many others that would, and Teela would do so without any regard for the consequences. And there will be many consequences, and you will live and you will continue to fight because I wouldn't have it any other way." As we see, the story is to be continued. And on the next page, we get an advertisement for Channel 52, all of the news, some of the facts, appearing in the back of all of your favorite comic books. I don't recall any of these Channel 52 pages, but then again, I was only subscribed to the Masters of the Universe comic from DC at this time and Batman, and I don't seem to recall this being in the back end of Batman, although it seems like it maybe should have been, given that that was one of the more popular titles at the time. We then reach the DC Comics All Access page. This page is about a character that was introduced during an episode of the Sci-Fi Channel's special effects show Face Off. I remember this show, and I may have watched a single episode of it once, but apparently there was one episode in which the contestants were charged with creating a new character for DC Comics, and the winner of that episode would have their character featured within the pages of DC. The winner created a character named the Infernal Core, who we can see right here facing off against Deadman. I don't know anything about this character or if they were ever utilized past this contest. Maybe Infernal Core still exists in the pages of DC today, and if he does, feel free to let me know in the comments below, but I didn't even know he existed until I read this page. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for the Kubert School, which of course is a school that aspiring comic book artists can attend to learn more about the comic book industry and hone their craft as artists. And that was He-Man and the Masters of the Universe number 6. Overall, I thought this was a great issue, and I thought it was a really good way to put a nice little bow on the end of this first 6-issue story arc. It does a very good job of setting up the upcoming story arc, where you not only have a new set of villains coming into the fray, but you also have a situation in which He-Man basically lied to Teela's face, and he's going to have to deal with the consequences of betraying her trust. And we also get to see exactly what's going to happen going forward now that the sorceress is confirmed dead, and there is no one guarding the secrets of Castle Grayskull. I believe that this is actually a really good way to set up the entirety of this series, and it really plays into a lot of other story points that happen later on down the line. But then again, these are all just my opinions. You may have thought that this was not the place they should have ended it and they should have drugged this out a little further, or that maybe He-Man shouldn't have defeated Skeletor in just a single issue and they could have maybe spread that out to a few issues and made the battle a bit more epic. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.